That's right, it's that time of week again. It's time for me to disappoint at least one NHL fanbase by not having their team ranked highly enough in my power rankings. It's week 8 of the NHL Power Rankings. Real quick though, before we jump right into it, I do want to mention that next week's Power Rankings will be a day late, so if you don't see them on Monday, don't worry, they still will be happening. They'll just be coming out on Tuesday, as I'll be recording them Monday of next week, with the Kraken playing Sunday night. With that out of the way though, let's jump right into it, as I do have 3 honorable mentions to get through this week before we get to the top 10. And I know I'm getting carried away with these honorable mentions a bit, but the first one is almost like an honorable mention. It's not really a team that I see as being that close to the top 10, at least not yet anyway, but they did have an incredible week, and I was definitely wrong about them in my preseason predictions, so I wanted to shout out the Arizona Coyotes, who did just beat the last 4 teams to win a Stanley Cup in succession in their last 4 games going back to last Saturday. And for that matter, if they beat the Capitals on Monday, they'll have gone 5 for 5 with the last 5 teams to have won a Stanley Cup all in a row. But even with the 4 wins they've already gotten here, that does get them now to 12-9-2 on the season, which still isn't good enough for the top 10. They'd have to get a few more wins in a row to get there, but it is still a lot better than certainly I expected, and I think the vast majority of people did. But anyway, as for a couple of teams that actually are close to breaking into the top 10, or maybe I should say re-breaking into the top 10, as both of these teams have already been there at some point over the time I've been doing this. First, I have the Toronto Maple Leafs. Now, the Maple Leafs, I don't know if they struck some kind of deal with cardiologists in the Toronto area before the season, but they have really been testing the heart health of their fan base with 11 overtime games already here in 22 games played, which does account for the majority of their wins, as they've won 7 of those 11 games. And that does mean then that they actually have fewer regulation wins than the San Jose Sharks, who are now up to 6. So it might not be the most convincing 12-6-4 record ever for Toronto, but they have been getting the results, and I think we all know, whether you like it or not, that this is a talented enough team that eventually you would think they will start getting a little bit more decisive wins under their belt. And ultimately, it really doesn't matter if they get more decisive wins, because if they keep winning as many games as they have, regardless of how they're winning them, they'll still be in the playoffs as one of the 3 teams out of the division. Well, I say they would be one of the 3 teams out of the Atlantic rather than a wild card, but that could be partially up to the other team I have here as an honorable mention in the Detroit Red Wings. Now, the Red Wings did have a bit of a stumble there after their hot start to the season, but they've bounced back with now winning 6 of their last 10 games for a similar 6-2-2 record to what Toronto has in their last 10. For Detroit, it seems like they might actually be able to make that push to the playoffs this year after having a bit of a bounce back and not just kind of falling off after that hot start like we'd seen in seasons past. Now, maybe their special teams and offense haven't necessarily rebounded in the full same way that their win-loss record has in these last couple of weeks, but again, the results are what matters in the end, and for the Red Wings, it does seem like this version of their offense might be a little bit more sustainable, as they're not fully relying on Larkin and DeBrincat to do all of the work for them. And that brings us to the top 10, which I will say are the same 10 teams that I had on the list last week, but in a different order. And if it wasn't for a 3-1 win in their last game of the week, Winnipeg would have found a way to change that by dropping out of this list entirely, as they did get shut out 2-0 by Dallas and lost 3-1 to Edmonton, and this is an Edmonton team that seems like it's gotten things figured out and is finally on the rise. Either way, had they not won that game against Chicago, they would not have remained even in this 10th spot. They would have been all the way out and not in this video whatsoever. They do get that win, so they salvage that 10th spot for now, but the Jets, well, Hellebuck's trying to keep them in it, but it's not been a great week for them. And it's a good thing for the Jets, too, that Hellebuck has continued to play well, because at 5-on-5, this team statistically is playing very similar to Seattle and Minnesota, neither one of which has had particularly good starts to the season. And so far, the big difference does seem to have been Hellebuck, as well as Kyle Connor scoring better than anybody on either of those teams. But still, up next in the 9th spot, I have the Florida Panthers. And I will say that this almost feels too low for the Panthers. I really tried to find a way to move them farther up this, and for what it's worth, I do think that 7, 8, and 9 are all pretty close to each other on this list. I could be convinced to rearrange them, but at least for right now, I have the Panthers at 9. Now, they still do feel like they're playing better than 9th place in the NHL, but they just haven't quite been getting the finishing or being able to finish the job in the same way that some other teams have. At 5-on-5, they're one of the best teams in the NHL, and as far as special teams are concerned, between power play and penalty kill, with expected goals, they are the best team at special teams in the NHL. But again, when it comes to actually finishing the job, their special teams are towards the middle or just above the middle in both categories. So once they can figure out how to get how they're playing to line up with the results they're getting, they will certainly move up this list. At least for now, though, they're just not doing it consistently enough to be any higher than 9th or at the very highest 7th, especially having won only 2 of their games out of 4 this week. They did lose in a shootout to Toronto, so that's basically a tie, but it's still just the 2 regulation wins. And they did also manage to lose to the Islanders, who I suppose are hot at the moment, but still. And actually, speaking of losing to the Islanders, the team I have in 8th also lost to the Islanders this week, although they did it in overtime, that being the Carolina Hurricanes. Now, the Hurricanes, like the Panthers, have been massively underachieving how they've been playing, especially at 5-on-5, even for being a team here in the top 10. But unlike the Panthers, this team, it doesn't have so much to do with their inability to finish on the offensive end or in special teams. It has a lot more to do with their big question marks in net at this point, as they just have not been able to find any consistency there, with both Kochetkov and Ronta, who have started 10 games apiece for the team, being under 900 save percentage, and actually Ronta significantly so, just above 850 in the save percentage category. And even for that, with Frederik Andersen on IR, in 6 games that he started, he too was just under 900 as well. So the goaltending has been an issue for this team all season long. At least for now, they do seem to have gotten back to that defensive structure that they had last season that got them the success that they had. But unless they find the answer in net, it might not matter once the playoffs start. Though obviously that's still a long ways away from now. It is still just the beginning of December, and they are at this point now starting to finally get the results, playing well enough in front of that shaky goaltending to get the wins that they need to get to the playoffs in the first place, with 2 wins this week, 4-1 over Philadelphia and 6-2 over Buffalo on either side of that 5-4 overtime loss to the Islanders. Then in the 7th spot, I have a team that's been kind of the polar opposite of those two combined in the Vancouver Canucks, who have been fantastic at finishing, and while they haven't necessarily had the best 5-on-5 stats this season, they have had fantastic goaltending from Demko. With that being said, they have started to play better in the defensive end at the very least. Their 5-on-5 stats now pointing to them being a better than average team defensively, and getting Zadorov from the Flames can only help that. Still, the Canucks do have some questions if Demko were to start faltering, but of course, regardless of whether or not the stats advanced or otherwise, or even the eye test for that matter, like the way that Vancouver's been playing, the same way as, say, Florida or Carolina, they too have been getting the results where it matters in the win-loss column and getting those points in the standings. And this week, they got 2 more of those wins, with a 3-1 win over Anaheim, as well as a 4-3 win over Calgary after getting Zadorov from them. Now, those wins are sandwiched around a 4-1 loss to Vegas, which, if that had been different, they might have actually moved up on this list, but they still do go 2-1 on the week, which is more than enough to continue to move up, well, not move up in the standings, but move closer to that playoff berth at the end of the year, and certainly more than enough to maintain a top 3 spot in the Pacific Division that is pretty weak outside the top 3. And then in the 6th spot, I have the Dallas Stars. Now, the Stars are a team that it doesn't really seem like you ever know what you're going to get from them night to night. You don't know what part of the game they're going to play well, but you usually know they're going to play some part of the game well. They could win 2-0, say, against the Winnipeg Jets, or they could win 8-1 against the Tampa Bay Lightning. And at the same time, they could show up and lose to Calgary Flames in overtime. You really just don't know what's going to happen. They could win from good goaltending or just putting up a whole bunch of goals. But even if the ways that they find ways to win games, or at least get points in the standings in their games, aren't always the same, what is consistent is that they do find ways to win games. And that is often the big difference between teams that are good and the rest of the pack, is that ability to find ways to win games. Again, the team that I follow has been more doing the opposite, finding ways to lose games. So yeah, it's definitely something that you'd like to see from your team. Plus, it certainly doesn't hurt that Jason Robertson has finally started scoring at the rate that we all kind of expected him to, and Ottinger is back to the Ottinger we saw at the start of the season, or at least close to anyway. He's certainly had a bounce back from a couple of rougher weeks anyway. Certainly the kind of thing that pretty much any goaltender is going to go through unless they're destined to win the Vezina at the end of the season. Now, as we get into the top 5, in the 5th spot, I do still have the Vegas Golden Knights, who, it has to be said, in really the last 3 weeks, have continuously done this thing where they kind of dip their toe in the water of trying out being a bad team, or at least giving the idea of not being the dominant team that we saw at the start of the season a little bit of a thought. But then after they get 2 overtime losses against both the teams in Alberta, they go and win back-to-back games 4-1 over Vancouver and DC. Both teams were in the top 10, or at least mentioned in the video last week. And for what it's worth, DC is still kind of in that bubble area, but it does seem like the way they've been playing is starting to catch up with them a little bit, and they might not be hanging around for that much longer unless they can figure out a way to score a little bit more often than they are. Anyway, this is about Vegas, and with this Golden Knights team, the consistency certainly hasn't been there over the last few weeks. The 4-3-3 record over their last 10 certainly isn't all that impressive, but it does kind of feel like they've been almost toying with their food a little bit when it comes to the standings and just not playing up to potential, but not in a way that's necessarily something that it feels like they can't just access whenever they want. And no, I'm not trying to suggest that they're intentionally going out there not giving 100% or trying to lose games, especially against division opponents like Calgary or Edmonton. But with this Vegas team, it really does kind of feel like they know they're going to make the playoffs, especially with the state of the Pacific Division at the moment, and are kind of just coasting their way there and are almost in just wait until late April mode at this point in the season already. Though if there are 2 Golden Knights players that haven't been coasting really at any point this season, it would be the 2 guys that they have in net in Hill and Thompson, who have combined to be the best goaltending tandem in the NHL, especially with the couple of stumbles that Boston had in net over the last couple of weeks. And in general, that tandem has been giving Vegas the best goaltending the NHL has to offer to this point in the season. Now, Demko is still probably the most individual excellent goaltender at this point, but that combination of those 2 in net has certainly given Vegas the ability to have that same level of goaltending in net every single night. Now, I will say that as it turns out, Vegas had every opportunity this week to jump into the 4th spot if it wasn't for those 2 overtime losses they had to the 2 Alberta teams. And that's because the team above them currently in 4th, where I still have the Colorado Avalanche, also had 2 overtime losses this week and then finished off their week with a regulation loss to the LA Kings, which is a game there without Cale Makar, so it's somewhat understandable, and the Kings we have yet to get to, so that's not necessarily a loss that I'm overly critical of Colorado for having, but going 1-1-2 on the week is also not a particularly impressive week, especially with those losses in overtime for Colorado being to Arizona, who we already mentioned the week that they had, but then also losing in overtime to the Anaheim Ducks, who had come into that game having lost 8 straight. So yeah, that's definitely a tough one for a Colorado team that had been playing very well over the last couple of weeks. Still, I ended up keeping the Avalanche here because I did feel like this top 4 team, and I said this last week, had a bit of a buffer between them and the rest of the list. And, well, none of the teams under Colorado really made a significant impression this week that would suggest they should be jumping all the way up into this top 4. In fact, I think this might actually be the first week that I've done these power rankings where none of the teams in this top 10 had a perfect week. So for the Avalanche, they do escape a bit of an iffy week, thanks to the fact that nobody else particularly stood out, but that gap has definitely closed between them and the rest of the pack. And with those 3 losses in a row now for the Avalanche, it also probably should be mentioned that this is starting to become a bit of a theme for this team here at this point in the season, where it's been very up and down, ebb and flow, kind of come in waves, streaky certainly when it comes to the standings, where they start out 6-0, then they lose 5 of 7, then they go and win 7 of 8, and now have lost 3 in a row. So if this continues to be one of these downtrends over a couple of weeks for them, come this time next week, they could be right back towards the bottom of this list. The other thing that the Avs loss to the Kings did, though, was open up a gap here between the 3rd and 4th spots on this list. And to be perfectly honest, coming into that game, had the result been flipped, say it was 4-1 Avs rather than 4-1 Kings, I was certainly considering, and probably would have pulled the trigger at that point, on moving the Avalanche up into the 3rd spot and moving the Kings down to 4. But as is, the Kings go in, well, don't go in, the Avalanche came into LA. Either way, the Kings handle the Avalanche, even if they were missing Makar, win it 4-1, and very much prove that they are deserving of a top 3 spot. And for that matter, a lot of people in the comments last week felt like 3rd was already too low for the Kings, but with them having lost to DC earlier in the week, I mean, if they'd won that game and then won this one against the Avalanche, I would have felt pretty good at moving them up into the 2nd spot. But with the earlier loss, I'll keep them here at 3. Still, this is a Kings team that is a very tough out, and they proved that again with the win over Colorado. Now, obviously with the Kings, there's also not a lot more to go off of than what we talked about last week with this team, especially with them only playing the 2 more games and splitting them 1-1, where the other 4 teams that make up this top 5 all played 4 games this week. So the Kings having a bit of a lighter week just means there's not quite as much to go off of. Once again, just like last week, they are the 2nd best team in the NHL when it comes to expected goals against at 5-on-5, second by an actual decent margin to the Carolina Hurricanes. So yeah, the Hurricanes very much playing very good defensive hockey, just the goaltending hasn't quite been there for them the same way that Talbot has been there for the Kings. And then on offense, they have dropped from 3rd now to 4th when it comes to expected goals for at 5-on-5. But when it comes to the actual goals for and against per game, they're still scoring the most goals per game in the NHL and giving up the 2nd fewest to the Vegas Golden Knights. Also, as a quick side note with the expected stats, I mentioned that Carolina was the best team defensively at 5-on-5. They're also the 5th best, just behind LA offensively at 5-on-5. So that really goes to show how well the Hurricanes are playing, especially at even strength, and how much they stand to improve if they can start to get the goaltending figured out. Anyway, as far as the Kings are concerned, again, 2 games was not enough to go off of as far as trying to move them up on this list. I know there were people in the comments last week that said they really thought they should at least be above the Bruins, if not 1st place. I still don't think 1st place is necessarily where they are, considering they're still not even 1st in their division. And some of that is due to games played, but the Bruins do have the same number of losses, but with 3 more wins on the record. And having played twice as many games this week, they also only lost the 1, having won 3 of their 4 games. So while there still is plenty to like about how the LA Kings are playing at this point in the season, for me, it's still the Boston Bruins in 2nd place. Again, if the Kings were to win 3 games straight, they would have the same record as the Bruins, but they do have to win 3 straight games to have the same results at the same point in the season that the Bruins are already at. And yes, the Bruins' 1 loss this week certainly was a worse one than the Kings' loss to the Capitals, as the Bruins lost their first game of the week 5-2 against a woefully bad Blue Jackets team. But they at least made up for it a little bit by finishing the week with a win over those same Blue Jackets. And again, like I said, won 2 other games this week against San Jose, who's even worse, and beat Toronto in overtime. Plus, they have the fun of having Marchand finish off the Maple Leafs in overtime there. So, yeah, not a bad week to be a Bruins fan, other than the very start of it. And by the end of the week, this is still a Bruins team that has the 2nd best record in the NHL. And it's not like they're that far behind the Kings in any of those expected stats, or even the goals for and against. Certainly the goals against. Goals for, they're certainly not scoring nearly as much as the Kings, but they really haven't had to with how good they've been at keeping the puck out of their net, aside from a small handful of games here over the last couple of weeks. I will say, though, that the gap between the Kings and Bruins is not a particularly big one, at least for me right now. So if the Kings do go on a run this week and the Bruins lose both or maybe even one of their games, depending on how well the Kings play, then this could get flip-flopped by this time next week. Or I guess, again, a day later, since I'll have to push it back till Tuesday next week. And that, of course, leaves still in 1st place and still the hottest team in the NHL, the New York Rangers. They've won 8 of their last 10 games. They win their last 3 games of this week after, like the Bruins, having a bit of a disappointing first game of the week, losing 5-1 to the Buffalo Sabres. And sure, they weren't the most convincing wins ever. 3-2 against Detroit, then 4-3 over Nashville, and finishing up with a 6-5 win over San Jose. So they do give up 5 goals to the Sharks, but in the end, it's 6 points in the standings and 3 regulation wins. Not that regulation wins mean anything different than an overtime win, other than you feel a little bit better about it, I guess. Either way, for the Rangers, they keep chugging along, having won now 8 of their last 10 games, which is more than any other team in the NHL can say over their last 10. And even if their advanced stats do leave something to be desired, they are below average when it comes to expected goals for and against at 5-on-5, which I pointed that same thing out to be true of Vegas and Vancouver when they were both in the top 3 on this list, and well, they found their way down it. For the Rangers, who do now have Fox and Shesterkin back, well, that might be something to at least keep an eye on here over the next couple of weeks as we move forward. At least to this point in the season, and certainly over the last few weeks, it does not seem to have affected them when it comes to getting the results that they want in the standings, which ultimately is where it matters most, unless you're, say, Florida State in college football. But this is the NHL where the standings do matter, and at least as far as I'm concerned when it comes to power rankings, that is probably the number one thing. I mean, I probably should say that it's certainly not everything when it comes to these power rankings. Otherwise, they'd be pretty boring. It would just be sorting by best records in the top 10. There is a lot more that goes into this than just the record, but it is a very important part of the equation. Anyway, with that all having been said, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. I'd love to know your thoughts down in the comment section below. Which teams I have too high, which teams I have too low, which teams didn't get included at all that you think probably should have. All the usual down in the comments. And until next time, again, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that help support the channel, so I'd appreciate you using them. And until next week, which if you are just here for the power rankings, again, will be a day later. It'll be Tuesday next week instead of Monday as usual, as I'll be recording it Monday night. Until then, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go whoever you want.